Greetings. This is Sunday, January the 3rd, and I'm Charles Chrestman. This is the first Sunday in 2021, and I would like to welcome you to this week's Bible study. We're continuing our study in Luke chapter 2 with a lesson entitled Matured. There will be 3 focal passages for today's lesson, and if you would like to follow along, you can do that in your Bible or with Lifeway's Explore the Bible Study Guide by turning over to Session 5. Let's get started. Let me first say good morning and Happy New Year to you and yours. I hope you had a good Christmas. As we left chapter 1 of Luke and moved into chapter 2, Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem as a part of the census ordered by Caesar Augustus. He had ordered the census, which was vital to taxation, be taken of the entire empire. Joseph had to travel to Bethlehem because it was the ancestral home for the descendants of David, and he was one of those descendants. The journey covered about 90 miles from Nazareth to the Judean hills, about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. As you know from last week's lesson, the trip took several days, probably by caravan or wagon. The influx of travelers to Bethlehem filled every room, so Mary gave birth to Jesus in a stable. Using a manger for a cradle, she laid down her newborn in the manger in infant's wrappings. The angel did not appear to the religious or political leaders of the day, but shepherds outside of Bethlehem. We are told, as the angel proclaimed the Messiah's birth, he was joined by a large multitude of angels who praised God. Last week we saw that Joseph fulfilled his duty to register his family for the census. It is believed they stayed in the area for several months. During this time, we're told they were visited by the Eastern wise men and others. The Mosaic law said that a mother was ceremonial unclean for 7 days after the birth of a male child. So on the 8th day, Mary's baby boy was circumcised as a sign of God's covenant with Israel, and he was given the name Jesus. The mother continued her purification for 33 more days. At the appropriate time, Joseph and Mary carried Jesus to the temple so they could dedicate him to God and make appropriate sacrifices. As Joseph and Mary carried Jesus to the temple, they met 2 elderly and godly people who made remarkable statements. You met both of these people in last week's Bible study. The first, Simeon, had anticipated the Messiah's advent for many years. In fact, God had promised him he would see the Christ before his death. The other was a sweet lady named Anna. She was a woman of God who remained in the temple constantly, serving God with prayers and fasting. Upon seeing the child, they both recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Now, one advantage to having multiple gospel accounts of what happened in the first 2 years of Jesus' life is there are various viewpoints that help one to have a complete picture of what occurred. There is a gap of about 12 years where we only have a summary of Jesus' growth. But we do know, thanks to the writers of the New Testament, that Jesus grew up like any other Hebrew boy, except without sin. We're told he grew strong in every way and was full of godly wisdom, and God's grace was on him, in verse 40, for example, in today's lesson. Luke re-engages us with Jesus' story with an account of the family's pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover when Jesus was 12 years old. Now, this trip was not a new one for Jesus, and that his family had made the trip every year. What made this Passover different was a situation that developed after the celebration ended. Now, families and friends often caravan together for fellowship and protection, and children commonly intermingled with each other's families. Joseph and Mary became aware that Jesus was not with them, so they hurried back to Jerusalem. After several days, they found him interacting with religious leaders at the temple. Now, this story is important for the value of Jesus' statement when Joseph and Mary located him. Even at this age, he knew who he was and who his true father was. And that gets us to today's first focal passage, which is taken from verses 41 and 47 in Luke chapter 2. Keep in mind the Passover festival recognized God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. It also symbolized the substitutionary atonement for the firstborn of each household. God commanded the people to observe this celebration each year as an act of remembrance. Let's see what Luke records for us in our first focal passage, starting with verse 41. Every year his parents traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the festival. After those days were over, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the traveling party, they went a day's journey. Then they began looking for him among relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And all of those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. You probably noticed Luke didn't describe the previous visits to the Passover celebration. Therefore, something about this trip made it different. Jesus was 12 years old, and as you will recall, at age 13, Jewish boys were generally considered to be men. Therefore, this journey occurred while Jesus was still considered to be a child. The narrative does not detail the events of the Passover festival, but focuses on a singular event, one that said, after those days were over, referring to the Passover festival. Now, the Passover formally took place on the 15th day of the month, but the overall festival lasted several days. As an observant Jewish family, they would not have traveled on the Sabbath, so this incident likely took place midweek after the Passover celebration. Luke tells us while the family was returning to Nazareth, Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. Joseph and Mary were obviously unaware of this from what Luke wrote. Luke tells us that after a day's journey, they started looking for Jesus, assuming that he was the other children. When they did not find him, they became anxious and returned to Jerusalem. Now, Joseph and Mary had traveled for a day, so it took another day for them to travel back to the city, and they spent another day looking for him, in that Jerusalem was a large city. When Joseph and Mary found him, he was in the temple. Luke noted as he talked with the teachers, his interaction was interesting. He was sitting among them. For a child to sit with the teachers of that day would have been very unusual in itself. Luke also noted that he was listening to them. He demonstrated respect toward these men as elders and teachers of the law, but he was also asking them questions. Luke tells us as Jesus engaged the teachers, everyone was astounded. Apparently, he displayed biblical understanding beyond his years. The phrase, all those who heard him, suggests other people were present in addition to the teachers. Notice that Luke presented Jesus' full humanity and full deity in this moment. Verse 47 tells us Jesus demonstrated concern for the things of God even as a child. His answers were astonishing. That gets us to our second focal passage, where we'll continue reading in verse 48 through 50. Please follow along if you like. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. In verse 42, Luke included something very interesting to me. He said when Joseph and Mary saw him, they were astonished. Now, astonished means greatly surprised or amazed. We're not sure whether they were astonished to find him or if they were astonished to find him in the temple. Notice Jesus' mother spoke to him first, asking him why he had treated them in this way. She also noted the anxiousness with which they had been searching for him. Jesus did not apologize, but rather asked his mother why they were searching for him. No doubt he genuinely wondered why they had found it difficult to locate him. And then Jesus' second question reveals his awareness of who he was, even though he was just 12 years old. He understood that God was his Father and the temple was his Father's house. Notice when Mary referred to your father and I, Jesus posed his question in a way that corrected her, but without being insolent. Luke then notes for us in verse 50 that they did not understand what he said to them. Luke records nothing further about the discussion in Jerusalem. He concludes the narrative with a simple statement that we find in our third and final focal passage today, recorded in verses 51 and 52. Follow along if you would like. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother kept all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with people. Luke notes for us in these verses that Jesus returned to Nazareth with Joseph and Mary and was obedient to them. As Jesus grew older, his mother kept all of these things in her heart. Jesus' statements at the temple brought back, I'm sure, all of those early memories that she had of him and reminded her again of his nature and purpose in life. With Mary, the unique nature of her child must have pressed each word and every action into her heart and her memory. Now, in Nazareth, Jesus developed like other children. He increased or grew in many ways. Now, Luke encapsulates Jesus' growth in three phases. The first was he increased in wisdom. Luke then said Jesus grew in stature, that is, physically. And thirdly, the writer said Jesus increased in favor with God and other people. In these three statements, Jesus showed us the value of obeying God's word for our spiritual and our social growth. We not only develop our relationship with God, but also with other people. Our study today of Jesus' own self-awareness concludes the introductory overture of Luke's Gospel. The structure in chapters 1 and 2 imitates the theology of forerunner and fulfillment, and there is more to come. I want to thank you for joining us today. This next week's lesson entitled Prepared will come from Luke chapter 3, where we will be reconnected with John the Baptist as he prepares the way for Jesus. I certainly hope you will join us. Until then, have a good week and may God bless you.